That morning, the backlands awoke differently. The sun, which always rose brightly behind the mountains, seemed timid, almost afraid to illuminate what had happened. The wind blew lightly, carrying the smell of dry earth and burnt grass, but the sound of the cattle call, that song that awakened the heart of the countryside, no longer echoed. The corral was silent. The silence was so heavy that even the birds seemed to respect the pain that hung in the air. The cowboy had left, and even the cattle, accustomed to the firm sound of his voice, wept for the absence of that man who was now only a memory on the horizon. His name was João de Araújo, but in those parts, everyone called him João do Aboio, João of the cattle call. A man of few words, with a generous heart and eyes that carried the weight of many lives. From a young age, he learned from his father that being a cowboy was more than a job. It was a calling of the soul. The leather on his shoulders, the sun cracking his skin, and the cattle call tearing through the wind were part of his essence. João didn't work with the cattle, he lived with them, understanding every look, every moo, as if the animals spoke a language only he understood. But on that day, fate decided to change the sound of the backlands. The people awoke with emptiness in their chests, the dogs barked at nothing, and Ventania, João's faithful companion, neighed incessantly, as if calling for his owner who never answers. The leather hat still hung on the nail, the leather jacket folded on the fence, the lasso thrown on the ground, everything there frozen in time, as if the world had forgotten to turn. The women of the village whispered, the men exchanged glances, but no one dared to say aloud what they felt. Because the backwoodsman, however strong he may be, knows well the pain of absence. And João was more than a cowboy. He was the soul of that piece of land. They said he had a gift. Where the cattle were lost, he found them. Where the earth cracked, he saw hope. But something inside him had broken, something that not even the most beautiful cattle call could heal. Some said he had left because of Rosa, the woman he loved with the strength of one who loves the impossible. Others swore it was the drought, which took not only the pasture but also the faith of the men. There were those who believed that João had grown tired of fighting against time, against the hard life, against destiny, but no one knew the truth. And perhaps João himself didn't know either. What everyone knew was that since his departure, the backlands were never the same. The sound of the cattle echoed differently, the nights seemed longer, and the wind, that wind that once carried the sound of the cattle call, now brought only the lament of longing. Old São Miguel, owner of the farm where João worked, swore he heard a distant cattle call at dawn, coming from the ravines, a sad song that would send shivers down the spine of even the bravest of men. "It's João," he would say, looking into the darkness. "It's João who hasn't really gone away." And those who passed by felt something strange, a shiver, a weight in the air, as if the backlands held a secret. The same secret that began that silent morning when the sun was slow to rise and the cattle cried without knowing why. What happened to João? Nobody knew for sure, but one thing was certain: nobody forgot, because the cowboy, before disappearing, left deep marks on the ground, on the animals, and in the hearts of those who remained. And the backlands never forget, because before leaving, João do Aboio left something that no one has ever been able to erase. A story that the wind still whispers when night falls and silence takes over the place. João do Aboio was the kind of man born with the backlands in his heart. Since childhood, the sound of the cattle call ran through his veins like an ancient calling, one that comes from another life. He would wake before sunrise, when the sky was still a mixture of purple and blue, and the cold morning wind would cut his face. The rooster's crow, the lowing of the cattle, and the creaking of the leather saddle were the hymn that announced the beginning of another day of struggle. João didn't complain. For him, work was a form of prayer, and each step taken on the cracked ground of the Caatinga was a silent conversation with God. His body was marked by scars, not from war, but from life. His hands, thick and firm, carried the weight of years holding rope and hope. The leather of his jacket, worn and faded by time, was almost a second skin. Sweat trickled down his sunburnt face, and his gaze, even tired, had that gleam of someone who finds beauty in simple things. Joam believed that the backlands were alive, that the land had a soul, and that the cattle understood the hearts of those who treated them with respect. "The cattle feel, young man," he would say. "They feel the fear, they feel the affection, they even feel when we're sad." The farm where he lived, called Serra do Vigario, was small, but it had a big soul. There, the cowboy didn't see the animals as work animals. He saw them as part of himself. When a calf was born, Joam was the first to see it. He would kneel beside it, carefully stroke its still wet hide, and silently give thanks. When an animal fell ill, he would stay awake all night, praying, mixing herbal remedies and faith. And when one died, his silence was louder than any tears. He didn't see the cattle as animals. He saw them as part of his own soul. His routine was difficult. The merciless sun burned his skin from early morning. The drought punished the pasture, and sometimes the wind brought more dust than hope. Even so, Joam remained steadfast. He mounted his horse Ventania, his companion on all journeys, and set off for the fields with his cattle call, cutting through the wind. It was a strong, beautiful, and melancholic sound. It seemed to carry the sorrows and joys of the entire backlands. Those who heard it from afar said that Joam's song calmed the cattle, and even the wind slowed down to listen. But life in the backlands isn't just about courage and dust. It's also about solitude. Joam would spend days without seeing anyone. Just him, his horse, and the sound of his own heart beating along with the trot on the dry ground. At night, when he returned, he would look at the sky covered in stars and talk to them as if they were old acquaintances. He would ask for protection, strength, and sometimes forgiveness. "God, give me courage for another day," he would murmur. His faith was simple but firm. He didn't need a church to believe. The horizon was enough. In his pocket, he always carried a piece of leather amulet, a gift from his mother, and he said it protected him from evil. In his saddlebag, a piece of rapadura, unrefined cane sugar, a handful of flour, and a small bottle of cold coffee. It was little, but it was enough. Joam knew that true wealth is not measured in money, but in peace of mind. And that he tried to preserve, even when the backlands seemed to want to swallow everything. The days dragged on amidst dust, cattle calls, and memories. Sometimes, sitting in the shade of a jujube tree, he would close his eyes and remember Rosa, the woman he loved as one loves the impossible. Her face would come to mind, with the scent of her perfume mingled with the damp earth of ancient rain, and he would smile, even if the smile hurt, because love in the backlands is like that, beautiful and painful, strong and silent. Joam was the kind of man who didn't complain but felt everything deep inside. Every lost cattle, every saved calf, every drought overcome, everything left its mark. And even when tired, he never failed to give thanks. "As long as I have cattle to tend and land to walk on, I'm alive," he would say. The villagers admired him, but few knew the weight he carried in his heart. Behind the stern cowboy was a man fighting something no one saw. A mixture of weariness and loneliness, an emptiness that the wind couldn't carry away. Joam smiled, but his gaze sometimes betrayed the pain of someone who carries the world on his shoulders and still finds the strength to sing. And it is in that silence between one cattle call and another that the soul of Joam do Arboio resides. A simple man of unwavering faith who loved the backlands as if he loved life itself. A man who, even facing the sun, the drought and longing, never lost the glimmer of hope. But fate, capricious as it always is with men of pure heart, had already prepared for him a journey that would change everything. A difficult choice, a path of no return. And it was there, between the sound of the cattle call and the silence of his soul, that the Backlands began to write the most painful chapter in Juon's story. Before we continue, I want you to tell me in the comments if you've ever met someone like Juon, someone who carries the weight of the world on his shoulders but still finds the strength to smile. Write in the comments, "I met a cowboy like that." I want to see who feels the power of this story in their heart, because what comes next, the Backlands will never forget. The sun no longer rose with the same brilliance on the Serra do Vigário. The hot wind blew, bringing dust and a strange silence, the kind that announces change. João do Aboio, who used to start his day singing, now sat quietly gazing at the horizon cracked by drought. The hard, colorless ground seemed to reflect what he felt inside. The rains had gone away months ago, the pasture no longer fed the cattle, and the earth groaned. The sound of hooves that once echoed loudly was now muffled by the animals' weakness. Deep bellies, sad eyes, even the cattle seemed to give up. João walked among them with his head down, trying to hide the pain that consumed him. He touched the head of each ox, as if asking for forgiveness. "Hang in there, my boys. Hang in there. The rain will come soon," he murmured. But even he no longer believed those words. Sometimes he would stand still, looking at the sky, trying to find a sign, a cloud, any hope. Nothing. Only the immense and cruel blue, burning away everything that remained of his faith. The drought wasn't just taking away the water, it was also taking away the spirit, the courage, the will to go on. The entire Backlands seemed to be on its knees, and João felt like he was the last man standing. His horse, Ventania, was already limping with exhaustion, its mane dull, its eyes sunken. "Hang in there, friend," he said, patting the animal's neck. "We've overcome so many droughts, this one won't break us both." But deep down, João knew this one was different, and it wasn't just the land that was drying up. Inside him, something was also beginning to die. The memory of Rosa, the woman fate had torn from his arms, returned like an open wound. 2 years ago, she had left for the big city seeking treatment. "It's just a temporary situation, João," she would say, trying to hide the fear in her eyes. "When I get better, I'll come back." But she didn't return. No letter, no news, only silence. And that silence grew inside him, like the emptiness that took over the farm. João would spend nights awake, sitting on the porch of his house with the oil lamp lit and his viola resting on his lap. He would play a note or two and stop. The sound came out weak, choked, as if his heart no longer had the strength to sing. "Does she still remember me?" he thought, looking at the starry sky. "Or has fate taken everything, even the memory?" Sometimes I would doze off with teary eyes, waking up to the sad crowing of the rooster and the dry smell of the morning. It was on one of those early mornings that he made the decision that would change everything. The water in the well had run dry, the cattle were barely getting up, and the boss, São Miguel, came to him with the heavy look of someone carrying a sentence. "João, you know I consider you like a son. But there's no way to keep the cattle going anymore. If the rain doesn't come in the next few days, I'm going to sell the rest and send everyone away." Those words hit hard. João felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. "Send me away," he repeated, his voice choked with emotion. "But boss, this is my life. I was born and raised on this land." São Miguel lowered his head, too afraid to look at him. "I know, my son. But even the earth has its limits when it comes to suffering." That night, João didn't sleep. He lay gazing at the sky and whispering to God, "What do you want from me, my father? I've drawn strength from where I had none. I've endured everything the Backlands threw at me. But now even the cattle are begging for mercy." He closed his eyes and wept silently. It wasn't a cry of weakness, it was a cathartic outpouring from his soul. Because sometimes the man of the Backlands doesn't cry, but his heart bleeds in silence. In the following days, João tried to resist. He dug holes to find a trickle of water, carried buckets, fed the animals with what little was left. But each attempt was in vain. One by one, the oxen began to collapse. Ventania could barely walk, and the silence grew ever more cruel. It was as if the entire backlands had stopped to watch the fall of a man who had always been greater than his own pain. Then came the moment he had so dreaded. The boss gathered the few remaining cowboys and announced the end. "Anyone who wants to can try their luck in the city. There's nothing left here." The words echoed like a gunshot to Joan's heart. He looked around and saw everything he loved crumbling. The farm, the cattle, the horse, the smell of the countryside, the sound of the cattle calls. Everything that had given meaning to his life was now dust. He mounted Ventania one last time, his gaze fixed and his soul shattered. The wind whipped against his face, carrying away the sweat and tears he hadn't even realized he was shedding. Perhaps it's time to go, he thought. But where does a man who only knows the backlands go? As the sun set, Joan's cattle call echoed faintly for the last time. It was a sad song, laden with farewell. The oxen raised their heads, the horse neighed, and even the wind seemed to stop to listen. The backlands understood that something was ending, and it was that evening, with a broken heart and a weary soul, that Juan do Arboyo decided to leave. I didn't know where he was going or for how long. I only knew that I needed to try to salvage what was left of myself. But fate had other plans for him, and what would follow would prove that the backlands can be cruel, but it also holds secrets that change the course of a man's life. Before we continue, comment below. The backlands also feel. If you believe that the land, the animals, and even the wind have a soul. I want to see who is feeling this story as I'm telling it, because what comes next will hurt even the strongest hearts. The day of departure arrived slowly, dragging along the weight of time, as if the very backlands wanted to prevent that moment from happening. The sun had barely risen and already burned the skin. The air was dry, and the dust rose lightly, coloring the sky with orange hues. Juan do Arboyo had been up since before dawn, sitting on the edge of the wooden bed, hat in hand and a lost look in his eyes. The simple house, made of rammed earth, held a silence that hurt more than any words. The still-lit oil lamp flickered on the table, and the flame seemed to weep with it. On the wall, the doublet hung. A companion on so many journeys seemed to beg to stay. Joan ran his hand over the dried leather, feeling its rough texture and remembering the times that same doublet had protected him from thorns, falls, and storms. Each scratch, each stain, was a vivid reminder of the life he was now leaving behind. "It was good while it lasted," he murmured in a hoarse whisper. Outside, the sound of Ventania's hooves broke the silence. The horse waited for him, restless, as if sensing what was to come. Juan walked towards him with slow steps, each movement heavy, laden with emotion. He ran his hand through the animal's mane, rested his forehead against his own, and closed his eyes. They remained like that for a few moments, breathing the same air, sharing the same pain. "It's over, my friend," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "The backlands have dried up, and our hearts have dried up along with them." Ventania snorted as if understanding. She moved her hooves, neighed loudly, and the sound echoed far, crossing the paths, waking the cattle scattered across the field. Joan took a deep breath and looked around. The fallen fences, the burnt pasture, the leafless trees. That piece of land had been everything to him. It was more than just land. It was part of his soul. There lay his memories, his pains, his joys. There lay buried his love for Rosa, his affection for the animals, the sweat of a lifetime. He walked to the corral. The gate creaked, as if it too were weeping at the farewell. The cattle, thin and tired, raised their heads when they saw the cowboy approaching. Joan whistled softly, and the sound of the cattle call came out weak, but still full of feeling. For a moment the backlands seemed to stop. The oxen approached slowly, as if they knew that this would be their last meeting. Joan stroked each one, calling them by name. "Go with God, Estrella. Strength, Branquinha. Be careful, Pretinho." And so he said goodbye, one by one, as one bids farewell to one's own family. His eyes burned, not only from the sun, but from the pain that came from within. "They'll miss you, João," said So Miguel, who watched him from afar, hat in hand, eyes brimming with tears. João didn't answer. He just looked at the sky and let the silence speak for him. When he mounted Ventania for the last time, the entire backland seemed to hold its breath. The wind stopped, the sound of the birds ceased. Even time for a second was suspended. João adjusted his hat, took a deep breath, and gave a light tap with his heel. The horse set off at a slow pace, dragging the sound of the horseshoe on the dry ground. Behind him, the cattle began to low in a sad lament, as if saying goodbye too. It was as if the backlands were crying along with him, every stone, every branch, every piece of land begging him not to go. John looked back one last time. He saw the farm disappearing in the dust, saw So Miguel standing at the gate, saw the cattle scattered, their eyes fixed on him, and in that instant he felt the weight of all the longing in the world. My God, how hard it is to leave where you belong. With each step Ventania took, the distance grew, and his heart ached more. The cattle call that once filled the backlands was now just a memory. The wind carried a distant echo of João's voice, mixed with the cries of the cattle. It was a sound that seemed to come from the soul of the land, a farewell that time would never erase. When he reached the top of the mountain, João stopped. He looked at the horizon one last time and took off his hat in respect for the land that had made him a man. From up there, he could see the entire expanse of the backlands, vast, dry, and yet alive. "Thank you for everything, my land," he said softly, his voice choked with emotion. The wind howled, the wind blew strongly, and a cloud of dust rose, covering them both for a few seconds. It seemed like the backlands trying to hide what hurt too much to see. João wiped away his tears with the back of his hand, pulled on the reins, and rode on. Behind him, the cattle calls faded. The herds fell silent, and the sounds of life gradually faded away. The backlands, which had always been harsh and valiant, wept that day, because the cowboy was leaving, and with him went a part of the very history of that place. As the sun hid on the horizon, the figures of João and Ventania gradually faded, swallowed by the distance, and the silence returned, heavy, cutting, full of longing. But this time, it wasn't an ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that speaks, that screams, that holds within it all the voices of those who have loved and lost. Anyone passing by that afternoon would have sworn to hear a distant cattle call coming from the middle of nowhere, a sad, drawn-out song that even made the wind stop to listen. Perhaps it was João do Arboio's last farewell, or perhaps it was the backlands trying to say that that man's love would never die. And it is at this point on the road between the dust and the memory that the heart of the story continues to beat, waiting for what comes next. Before we move on to the next part, tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced a goodbye that hurt so much it felt like the whole world stopped for a moment? Write in the comments, "I felt that goodbye," so I know you're feeling this story along with me, because what comes next is going to hit me really hard. After João do Arboio passed away, the backlands never woke up the same way again. The countryside, once full of life, was now a scene of silence and remembrance. The sun still rose brightly, the wind still blew through the dry branches, but something was missing. A soul was missing. The cattle call, which echoed every morning, guiding the cattle and cradling the days, now lived only in the memory of the wind. It was strange how the absence of a man could change the sound of an entire place. Even the silence seemed heavier, as if I had learned to carry longing. The corral was empty, the gates creaked aimlessly, swaying in the hot wind. The cattle walked slowly, aimlessly. They no longer responded to the new calls of the other cowboys, who tried in vain to imitate João's song. The sound came out weak, soulless. The animals looked at each other confused and returned to grazing in silence, as if waiting for the return of the one who understood them without needing words. The horse, Ventania, now free, lived circling the farm gate. He neighed, looking at the horizon, and then returned, dejected, as if he understood he was calling a ghost. At night, the wind blew through the trees, and for a few moments it seemed that Joan's cattle call echoed again, coming from afar, mixed with the sounds of nature. The people of the village said it was his spirit wandering through the backlands. Some swore they heard his voice at dusk. Others recounted seeing a shadow mounted on a white horse crossing the field under the moon. Old and tired old Miguel would say softly, "He didn't go away. He just became part of the backlands." And perhaps it was true, because there are men who don't die when they leave, they transform. Joan was one of those. His cattle call mingled with the wind, his sweat turned to dust, and his soul spread to every corner of that land. He was the archetype of the silent hero, the one who faces the impossible, who fights to the end, not for glory, but for love. Love for the land, for the animals, for simple life. Carl Jung said that the hero is the one who plunges into his own pain to find the meaning of existence. Joan did that even without realizing it. His departure was not an escape, it was surrender. It was the sacrifice of a man who understood that sometimes it is necessary to leave everything so that something greater may continue to live. Deep down, the entire backlands seemed to understand this truth. The dry trees, the vanished streams, the emaciated animals, all held within them a piece of that cowboy's soul. He represented the purest and most tragic aspect of the backlands man, the capacity to endure the unbearable, to smile even when his heart bleeds. Joan lived the struggle of so many others, the invisible struggle of those who give themselves for love, and in the end are remembered only by the echo of their own silence. The days went by, and time covered the marks of their departure. The farm was sold, the fences were moved, but no one dared to touch the old corral. It was like an altar. Sometimes children from the village would go there to play, and the sound of their laughter echoed between the old planks. And anyone who listened carefully enough could swear that mixed with that sound, there was a distant, almost imperceptible cattle call, as if Joan was still there, taking care of everything as he always had. And it's curious to think, perhaps destiny made him more than just a man. Perhaps it made him a symbol, a portrait of the backlands in the form of a soul. One who carries the weight of the world with dignity, who suffers without making a fuss, who disappears without asking for anything in return. Jung would say that Joan was the archetype of the wounded hero, the one who needs to lose everything to understand his own purpose. And in the silence that remained, the entire backlands learned the value of what he represented. Old Miguel liked to sit on the porch at dusk, gazing at the reddish horizon. Sometimes he would close his eyes and say, "Listen, it sounds like Joan's cattle call," and the wind would indeed carry a distant, sad, dragging sound, a song that no longer came from anyone's mouth, but from the earth itself. It was as if the backlands breathed through that melody. Even after so much time, the animals seemed to recognize that sound. Ventania, now older and tired, still raised his head when the wind blew stronger, as if he heard his friend's call. He would remain motionless for a few minutes, his ears alert, and then neigh softly in a gentle lament. It was longing taking shape, the bond that even time could not break. The people said that the silence that followed Joan's cattle call wasn't absence, it was presence. Because silence, when laden with memory, isn't empty. It's life disguised as pain. The backlands learned this. They learned that departure isn't always the end. Sometimes it's the beginning of something greater, the birth of a legend, a story that time cannot erase. And so amidst the wind and dust, between the past and the present, Juan do Arboyo remained alive. Not in eyes, nor in words, but in feeling. Every man who passed by and looked at the empty field felt a shiver, an invisible, strong presence, as if the very backlands were watching. His silence spoke louder than 1,000 words. It said that pain can be sacred, that love for the land never dies, and that there are souls that belong more to the earth than to heaven. Juom was one of those souls, and the backlands now were the body where it rested. And you, who are following this story, have you ever felt that someone who has passed away still lives on in every corner, in every memory, in every detail of your day? If you have felt this, write in the comments, "Silence also speaks." And I want to see who feels this connection, because what comes next will touch the hearts of those who believe that true love never disappears. It only changes form. The years went by, and time, that old invisible sculptor, continued to mold the backlands in its own way. The rain returned a few times, bringing a timid green, but what truly reborn didn't come from the earth. It came from memory. The memory of João do Aboio persisted like a deep root that not even the hottest sun could uproot. It was as if, even after he was gone, he was still there, breathing along with the wind, guarding the backlands from the inside out. The villagers began to speak of him as if he were a myth. Stories about the cowboy who sang with his soul spread, passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation. Some said that, on full moon nights, the cattle call could still be heard coming from the top of the mountain, echoing softly, like a song of longing. Others swore that when the wind blew stronger, the corral gate would sway on its own, as if the cowboy was still returning to tend the cattle. And there were those who said they saw, high on the hill, the silhouette of a man mounted on a horse, gazing at the horizon, quiet, eternal, the invisible guardian of the backlands. The old farm, once abandoned, began to attract visitors. People came from far and wide to see the corral where João worked, to touch the worn wood and feel the energy of that place. Many said they could smell the leather, hear the cattle call, feel his living presence. So Miguel's eldest son, who inherited the land, decided not to tear anything down. He left everything as it was, out of respect. He built a small wooden cross next to the gate and wrote on it, "Here rest the memories of a man who never left." Aye, and it was there that the backlands learned the meaning of the word legacy, because João left no wealth, no written inheritance, nor his name in a book. What he left was feeling. He left the example of a simple man who works in silence, who fights even when he knows he will lose, who loves what he does with the strength of someone who expects nothing in return. He left the lesson that true value lies in invisible things, in faith, in honesty, in love for the land and for animals. Every child born there heard his name early on. Parents told stories of the cowboy who talked to the cattle and faced the sun with the same respect he had for the rain. And every time a new cowboy mounted a horse for the first time, someone would say, "Remember João do Aboio. Ride firmly, sing with your heart, and never abandon what you love." It was almost a prayer of the backlands, a silent promise that his spirit would continue to guide those who came after. The nights in the backlands still held an air of mystery. Sometimes the wind would blow too strongly, and the dogs would start barking, staring into nothingness. The elders would say, "It's João passing by to see if everything's all right." And there was solace in that belief. The people learned to cope with longing as one learns to cope with drought. It's not conquered, but one lives with it. Because there are hardships that hurt, but there are also memories that never die. Ventania, the horse that was João's faithful companion, lived for a few more years. Already old, he spent his days near the cross, neighing softly, gazing at the horizon. He seemed to wait for his owner to return. And one day, the horse also departed peacefully, lying in the shade of the same jujube tree where João used to rest. He was buried there, and the people placed another cross beside the first. Since then, whoever passes through that stretch feels a different kind of peace, as if time pauses for a moment to listen to the wind tell stories. The backlands, which once mourned absence, have learned to smile with remembrance. They have learned that true love does not end with distance, that the sound of the cattle call, even silent, continues to echo within those who heard it. And every time the rain falls, bringing back the scent of wet earth, it seems that the cowboy is there again, smiling, hat in hand, thanking heaven for the miracle of life. Old Miguel was the last to leave. They say that shortly before dying, he looked out the window and whispered, "I'm hearing the cattle call." And that's how the cycle closed. Not with pain, but with the certainty that love leaves traces that time cannot erase. Today, those who visit those lands will not find luxury or wealth, but they will feel something greater. They will feel presence, the wind that blows, the rustling of the leaves, the distant sound of an imaginary cattle call. Everything there carries a little bit of joy. And perhaps that is the true meaning of life, to leave something in the world that continues to speak for you, even when your body no longer speaks. Deep down, the Backlands never forgot. Because there are men who pass through, but there are others who remain, even after the last ride. Juan do Arboyo was one of those. He became the symbol of what it means to be a Backlands man at heart, strong, loyal, resilient, and at the same time, full of tenderness. The kind of man who lives with an open heart, even knowing that the world is harsh. And when the wind blows strongly, bringing the scent of earth and memories, it seems as if he is still there, mounted on Ventania, gazing into the infinite, singing to God and to the Backlands. The cattle call that echoes now comes not from anyone's mouth, but from eternity. And if you felt all of this, if this story reminded you of someone you miss, write the word saudade, longing, nostalgia, in the comments. I want to see who's listening to this cattle call along with me. And if you believe that the love and strength of the people from the Sertão, Brazilian Backlands, deserve to be remembered, share this video with someone who understands the soul of the countryside, with someone who has felt the silence of a farewell and knows that the Sertão never forgets.